everyone. This is Matt Carney, EdTech Summer 2023, Intermediate Milestone number 2, and I'm building a web app for my project. So I'll start with a little bit of background and then I'll jump into a demo. So I am building Grid Vatis, and so it is a line rating educational sandbox. So when we talk about line, we're talking about transmission lines for energy, and we talk about rating. We're talking about the steady state thermal rating. So there's lots of different considerations for the safe operation of the grid, but one of them is the steady state thermal rating. And essentially, there's a maximum temperature that the conductor cannot exceed, and then you calculate the ampacity, which is the max current, determined by these variables right here. So the convected heat loss per unit length, radiated heat loss per unit length, heat gain rate from the sun, and the AC resistance of the conductor at that set temperature. And so this equation is governed by the IEEE 738. It's kind of this big, long, nasty thing. But what's important to know is that different environmental conditions influence that rating. So ambient temperature, wind speed, wind direction, and the solar irradiance. Okay, so as an overview, like I mentioned, the app I'm building is called Grid Vatis. Vatis is a Latin term used to refer to a prophet, seer, or poet, someone who is believed to possess the ability to predict in the future. And so there's three main components to it. So the benefits of a dynamic line rating. So there's three main paradigms which grids and utilities can operate their transmissions lines at. So static is you're taking sort of a worst case scenario, so a 99th percentile based on historic data, and you're taking one reading quarterly, and you're saying, okay, well that's the maximum ampacity that we can operate at, and that's fine. It's just quite conservative, right? Because you're not always operating. You're not always at that worst case scenario, so you're missing out on some efficiency, some additional current that you could be pushing through when you're not at that 95th percentile. The second is called ambient adjusted. So this includes an hourly ambient temperature. So it's a little bit of a refinement on that static rating. And then the last one is the dynamic line rating. And so this includes hourly data for the ambient temperature, the wind speed, the wind direction, and the solar irradiance. And that's either coming from an advanced numerical forecast or sensors. So this first page, which I haven't built yet, it's just going to articulate and demonstrate sort of the gains you get as you work through these different, this increased sort of data granularity for those different paradigms. The second is a sensitivity analysis. So if you think about the dynamic line rating, it's really a forecast. If you want to predict the dynamic line rating in the future, you need to make forecasts for each of those environmental conditions, and thus your dynamic line rating is a forecast. And I want to build some intuition, about how the different weather forecasts impact the dynamic line rating. So how does uncertainty within temperature impact the dynamic line rating versus wind speed, etc. And the last one is a scenario analysis, where there's just some preset scenarios that you can match with the ampacity profile. All right, so I'm still working on the homepage, the landing page, so the benefits of DLR and the references, but what I have is this. So the sensitivity tab, like I mentioned, so it takes a little bit to load. I would say it's kind of right at the cusp from a performance perspective. There's a little bit of a lag. I'm going to go back. I'm building this with Streamlit Python based. I'm going to go back and see if there's anything that I can vectorize or just to increase the load or decrease the load time a little bit. So up top we have the dynamic line rating forecast. And then down here, we have the different environmental forecasts. And so as you can see, there's a gradient color scale that just as it goes from blue to red, it is showing you the certainty or the likelihood, the probability of that value. And then on the left side are the different variables for each of the environmental forecasts. So the idea being here, so if as you increase, for instance, if you increase the wind velocity, that gives a more of a cooling effect. So you can see here how as I change that, the actual um, dynamic line rating forecast increases. Yeah, the idea is really just a sandbox. So, how you can change, each of these different starting values, and also the different standard deviation. Um, the What's going on behind the scenes here is essentially a bunch of different Monte Carlo simulations, and it's starting with a normal distribution, and as time progresses, it's becoming more uniform as it steps through these, yeah, steps through the x-axis here. That's another thing I need to change. I need to change this to actual data axis instead of just these standard units. Yeah, the one other thing that I was kind of grappling with is, whether to have fixed y-axes or dynamic. So the benefit to having, a fixed y-axis is as you change any of these parameters, you can, it's easy to see these figures move. The downside is, you lose a little bit of, or just can be hard to see because you're so zoomed out. But one thing that's cool with Plotly is that you can hit this auto scale. So it's a little bit of best of the both worlds. It's fixed y axes initially, and if you want to zoom in, you can hit that. So yeah, still working out some kinks here, but overall it seems to be working okay. And then the second tab is the probabilistic weather scenarios. And so the goal here is, for the user, so after they go through the benefits of the DLR, I'll also have some bit about, the different, how the different forecasts impact the rating. They can play around with the sensitivity a little bit. And then they're presented with, so the ampacity, and then 4 different profiles. And they, they're asked to determine the ampacity profile based on the environmental conditions below. So the first one is cool temperature, moderate wind, inconsistent wind angle to the transmission line. And essentially, when you have the wind angle that varies a lot, that also impacts the ampacity a lot. So if you have a wind angle that's perpendicular to the line, lots of cooling, but actually if it, as it gets closer to 0, it's that wind angle is running parallel to line, it doesn't have as much of an effect. And so the key here is that if they look through these 4 options, they should see, the goal would be that they would see that this one is inconsistent wind angle, and then they would be able to identify, well, what is profile 2. So you get this drop down, a little bit of text. I'm going to beef this up a little bit, but right, profile 2, the extreme fluctuations being driven by the inconsistent wind angle. And then it's the same plot, but the correct profile is made a little bit more bold. And then, so for the second one, cool temperature, moderate wind angle, consistent, or moderate wind velocity, consistent wind angle. So they should, hopefully they note that, this 45 degrees is just the average of the range for the inconsistent. And so, because, there's 3 different profiles that don't have those big fluctuations like the profile 2 does. And so hopefully they would be able to see, or they would be able to guess that profile 3 matches this prompt. Great, just like I described before. And then, so these last 2, so they keep the consistent wind angle of 45 degrees, and then they, instead of, they go cool temperature, low wind velocity, and hot temperature, high wind velocity. So these are obviously like qualitative, kind of variables that are being fit into there. But the idea is to say, okay, well, like, which is more important here? A low wind velocity and cool temperature, or a hot temperature and high wind velocity? And in fact, so the cool temperature, low wind velocity gives you a lower overall ampacity rating. So like it says, while the temperature is cooler, the lower wind velocity reduces the overall velocity. Lower wind velocity reduces the overall ampacity. And then finally, for the last one, is that so the ambient temperature is hot, the higher wind velocity increases the overall ampacity. So that the goal, what they should be pulling out of this, is that wind velocity has a huge effect on that ampacity equation. When you also, and similarly, does wind angle, when you have an inconsistent wind direction, you're going to have a lot more uncertainty, variability in your rating. And yeah, that's it. I mean, I think as far as feedback or kind of the ask, if there's any general feedback you have just on the aesthetics, or any ideas on how I could improve this, I'm open to suggestions. Otherwise, thank you for your time.